Imagine a future without the burden of choice, where you will own nothing, live in the pod, eat the bugs, have no privacy, and most importantly, you will be happy. It is time to ask ourselves, so we're back to the fire rises, and today we will bring about the techno-corporate utopia foretold in The year is 2020 and the dawn of a new decade greets Germany. We are home to a diverse political landscape, but let's just say they won't be relevant in this playthrough. The mighty Bundeswehr was a whopping 50,000 strong. Wow. Can somebody tell the Germans that the Treaty of Versailles isn't a thing anymore? My complaining aside, it was time to convene the Bundestag. And the first order of the day? Dismantle all of our nuclear plants. Because as we all know, nuclear waste is literal glowing green goo in barrels that is super duper dangerous, guys. Anyway, it was time to focus on domestic issues. Reports were emerging of the COVID-19 coronavirus, and before long, cases appeared within our own borders. Before we could catch our breath with an impending pandemic, the oil crash crippled our economy and the opportunistic Russians seized the crisis to raise our oil prices. Damn it! If only we had some sort of energy alternative. The oil crisis highlighted the need for us to achieve energy independence. How are we going to do that, you ask? By making use of the fully natural, eco-friendly, and highly efficient resource, coal. On the plus side, our mask mandates and crackdowns had finally paid off and we could reopen the country and economy. I guess the game heard I was actually enjoying having an economy and yanked it away from me when the Second American Civil War broke out and dragged the world's economy, including ours, into the gutter.
I just can't do it. I can't take this shit no more, man.
All of these economy debuffs left us with a grand total of 3 civs on construction. But don't worry, National Focus, Revive the Ruhr, will give us a whopping extra 1 civ. But over in Russia, the youthful, tech-savvy Medvedev guy won the election. I see a bright, peaceful future of cooperation between us. As part of our plan to recover from economic depression, we gave out bailouts to pretty much everyone. And it worked. With the economy back in good health, it was time to focus on the long-neglected German military. We moved up to limited conscription and got rid of our insane army debuffs. Instead of focusing purely on the Bundeswehr, I decided to improve Europe's armies as a whole. Oh, and also, Belgium decided to just dissolve? I'm pretty sure this happens in every game and I don't know why, but at least we got a bit of land from it. One by one, more divisions were added into our army and the economy soldiered on as best it could, but it was looking like it may be too little too late as our intelligence indicated that the Russians were planning for a massive conventional war with NATO.
I'm telling you now, I have plans that I cannot share with you right now because the haters will sabotage me.
With army XP flowing in, we could finally change our officer corps and our templates. The impending storm from the east meant that Europe needed to be united more than ever before, thus we empowered the Volt Europa party. Once again, German tanks entered into Poland, but this time for the purpose of protecting it. And just as we had predicted, Russia invaded Ukraine like a moth to a flame. We weren't directly involved in the war yet, so all I could do was send some volunteers. And by the time they had arrived, the Ukrainian army was almost entirely on the retreat throughout the eastern half of the country. I nearly lost hope seeing the Russian Air Force that my pitiful air volunteers and soon my actual Air Force would have to contend with. We did manage to cut off and encircle a Russian spearhead in Kherson, but it took forever to destroy a single Russian paratrooper unit despite being encircled and attacked by 10 divisions at once. I decided to send aid to Ukraine, but it looked to be all in vain as the Russians nearly captured everything east of the Dnieper and encircled half of the Ukrainian army in the Donbass. We moved to crush the Transnistrians, but before that could happen, skirmishes erupted on the Polish-Belarusian border, undoubtedly the work of Russian saboteurs. This caused NATO Article 5 to be invoked, bringing us into direct war with the Russians. The European war had begun. Immediately, I moved to counterattack and cut off the Russian advance in western Ukraine, and once it was pushed back, I reinforced the front with almost my entire army to tie up as many Russian divisions here as possible. For once, my allies had actually done something useful and destroyed the Russian units stationed in Kaliningrad. When the winter season came, the Russian advance in western Ukraine came to a halt. But the same couldn't be said for the front line in the east, where the Russians had broken through Dnipropetrovsk and were threatening to completely outflank the entire NATO army. We were winning in the skies at least. The rest of the NATO air forces joined in to contest the skies over Ukraine, actually giving us a chance against the behemoth that is the Russian Air Force. We were also advancing in the Baltics, where we managed to cut off and destroy 2 Russian tank divisions. Our fortunes quickly reversed in Ukraine, with the Russians breaking through NATO defenses and trapping more than 20 divisions in Kiev. All the while, my generals were advising me to launch a naval invasion into Russia when we were actively on the retreat in Ukraine. I guess this is why my previous playthrough had so many damn naval invasions. Despite our best attempts to relieve the pocket, the Russians kept increasing their pressure elsewhere in the front. In addition, the Russians had pushed through our flanks in both the north and the south, forcing us to pull out or risk our entire army being encircled as well. We couldn't risk allowing Ukraine to capitulate, as they were enduring the brunt of the Russian assault. The Russians had also achieved another breakthrough, nearly cutting off NATO divisions in Latvia and Estonia. We arrived to stop it just barely in time for the rest of our army to pull back to safer positions. Once Lithuania capitulated, we had effectively abandoned the Baltics. By now, the NATO casualties were looking absolutely disgusting, while the CSTO was practically unharmed. Even though we had been forced to retreat again and again, our economy was fully mobilized and was soon going to be able to keep up with the Russians. Of course, being a part of NATO meant having allies who launched pointless and suicidal naval invasions. I could only watch as dozens of divisions that could have reinforced the deteriorating Polish front were encircled and slaughtered.
Will this brilliant plan involve us climbing out of our trenches and walking very slowly towards the enemies?
How could you possibly know that, Blackadder? It's classified information.
And just as I say that, the Greeks arrived to be slaughtered next, but at the very least, the front line was somewhat stabilized for once. We even made some successful counterattacks, but it was all for nothing when the Ukrainians capitulated. And due to this, 2 of our units were trapped in Russian territory, but we had no hope of retrieving them. I had to send half of my army to Romania to make sure the Russians didn't just steamroll through the Balkans. And in Poland, I had no choice but to withdraw to the Vistula to have any chance of holding our positions. Not that it mattered anyway, as the Russians immediately pushed us out when they reached the new defensive line. The NATO front line crumbled in the Balkans, forcing us to pull out our entire army before it was pinned to the borders of Serbia. By this point, the defense of Poland was a lost cause. Warsaw had already been encircled, and we withdrew to the last place we could, the German border. With the fall of Budapest and the capitulation of Poland, we had no choice but to surrender and concede Eastern Europe to the Russians. You know, it doesn't really sound as good when you're on the losing side. For the 5th time this playthrough, the German economy collapsed again. The massive loans we took out to finance the Bundeswehr's expansion during the war came back to bite us. Riots broke out in the streets as we tried our best to cope with the economic catastrophe. In the meantime, European leaders met in Brussels to discuss why the war had been lost, and they had come to the conclusion that it was because of our disunity. Europe could only survive united. Once Volt Europa had won the emergency elections, it was time to take the first step to uniting Europe. The European Parliament was convened, and the European Union was officially federalized in Germany and the Benelux. Europe would be rebuilt under our technocratic utopian vision. Our brothers in France descended into civil war, requiring us to send volunteers to restore order. The same happened in the UK as pro-EU freedom fighters rose up against the tyrannical regime of Nigel Farage based on...
Based on what?
We tried to send some volunteers, but they immediately capitulated right after we arrived. Once France was cleaned up, I tried to salvage the situation by sending volunteers to Scotland instead. We were so close to capitulating the UK until they pulled a Steiner and forced us to retreat. I just had to settle for farming them for XP. Back at home, we conducted a great reset of Europe's economies. This of course involved giving the corporations a seat in the government and allowing them more and more control over your life. Don't worry though, you'll be happy. Over in Ireland, the Irish Republic launched a senseless war of aggression against the Republic of Ireland. This is that Monty Python scene all over again.
Are you the Judean People's Front? Fuck off, Judean People's Front. Well, the People's Front of Judea.
We moved forward into the future, ushering in the 4th Industrial Revolution, courtesy of Mr. Schwab.
Population control!
We were building the Europe of tomorrow, even if we had to sacrifice our freedom and privacy. Oh, did I say our? I meant...
Thank you for your sacrifice!
But all of these changes would mean nothing if we couldn't stand up to the Russian imperialists. So it was time to... invite the rest of Europe into our union. Suddenly, the game reminded me that I wasn't the main character by having India, Pakistan, and China all nuke each other at once, probably making World War I and II look like Nerf Wars in comparison. Back in Europe, the French and the Italians joined up immediately. Unfortunately, the Portuguese and the Spanish unwisely refused, but we simply denied their refusal and invaded them to change their mind. At first, things were going good right up until we ran out of fuel. I guess I shouldn't have made my entire army out of tank divisions. Our diplomats were also on their way to Ireland to convince them of the benefits of joining the EU. Witnessing the fall of Ireland, Portugal and Spain, the rest of Europe fell in line and decided to join us without firing a bullet. The Scandinavians joined eagerly, and the Poles, when given the chance to exact revenge on the Russians who had divided their country, simply couldn't refuse. Backed by the combined industrial might of Europe, our army swelled massively. The few remaining nations stupid enough to resist were crushed under the boots of a 2 million strong European army. The stage had been set for us to finally avenge the humiliation of the European war. Marines were primed to land and retake the British Isles, while another part of our army rushed to the Balkans. Our armies planned to storm the east and end the Russian experiment once and for all. After several years of preparation, the European army would cross the Oder, marking the beginning of the second and final European war. The opening hours of the war were a mixed bag. Our tanks smashed their way through Poland, but the terrain of the Balkan front prevented either side from making a big push. Still, once the initial line of divisions was disorganized, we kept up the momentum and continued pushing. We did what Germany never could and successfully landed in the British Isles, paving the way for the rest of the mechanized to follow in behind them. Over in Poland, we had already reached the banks of the Vistula River, but the Russians would not have the luxury of holding the river line. We encircled 9 tank divisions, and when our mechanized divisions landed in Britain, we capped them so fast that they just died off screen. Through Kaliningrad, we liberated Lithuania and Latvia with almost no resistance. The tables had been turned, and we avenged our NATO brothers who had died in Warsaw all those years ago. We did lose some territory in the Balkans, but it paled in comparison to our massive advance into Eastern Europe. By now, the CSTO was so disorganized and overstretched that they couldn't fully cover the front line, allowing us to make quite a few encirclements. From this point on, here's a counter for all the divisions we encircled. It seemed that the further east we went, the thinner the front line got. When our tanks entered Belarus and Ukraine, that was when the encirclements really got going. Here, I think it's better if I just showed you. After all of that, it was no surprise that once we reached the outskirts of Moscow, we encountered minimal resistance, except for a single division.
I move for no man.
The Russians were effectively neutralized as a threat, leaving only the Balkans to deal with. A very infamous Austrian man once said that we need only the kick in the door and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down. But in this case, we just found the back entrance. Our waves of armored locusts swept through the Balkans, and in a few short weeks, it was over for them. All that was left to do was to finish off the Russians and send them fleeing into Siberia. The Russians finally collapsed and Europe would no longer be threatened. We had won, and the end of history was here. That marks the end of this campaign. I really enjoyed this playthrough and I hope you did too. Thanks for all the support you guys have shown on my first video, and there will be more to come. I'll see you in the next one.